All right, welcome back. I hope you're having an amazing time so far. Our next speaker is Ioana Boier. She is the head of Quantitative Portfolio Solutions at Alphadyne Asset Management. Please join me in welcoming Ioana to our virtual stage.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ioana, as Patricia said, and in this presentation, I'd like to focus on the challenges of modeling causal relationships, both from a domain-specific perspective, I work in quantitative finance, as well as from broader AI machine learning perspective, because thinking about the challenges that we have in finance with modeling causality, I realized that they're really shared and they're common at a more fundamental level. So I have a disclaimer to show first before I begin. Should be on your screen. And then the agenda is to begin with some definitions of causality and then highlight some important nuances that I think are very relevant to causal inference. For example, the most basic questions around this topic are how do we identify causal relationships? And how do we measure the strength of such relationships? So I'll try to show some experiments that I did on financial data. And if we have time at the end, also go over some state of the art in finance and machine learning as to how people are thinking about incorporating causality into their models. So let's start from the very basics. What is causality? And this is a question that has fascinated people and philosophers from ancient times. As a scientific formalism in modern times, it has emerged probably around the same time as statistics, right? When Galton and Pearson were studying heredity, but kind of took a back burner spot because it's such a tough problem to crack. And today it is back, I think, in my opinion, due to its importance to human reasoning and intelligence, and also thanks to the work of many researchers who have kept it alive and promoted a theory of causality, like Judea Pearl, for example, whom I've quoted here. My favorite definition of causality is the one that belongs to Hume, who calls it the prerequisite and result of imagination. And I think this is super relevant in artificial intelligence because people are now trying to break away from the so-called narrow intelligence, right? Task-oriented intelligence to defining and hopefully at some point achieving artificial general intelligence. And because imagination is such a fundamental part of human intelligence, and in terms of let's say machine learning lingo, we are able to imagine things with very little training, so to speak. So there is this notion of few shot learning or even no shot learning, right? We use our prior knowledge and our imagination to come up with plausible alternatives, even if we've never seen something before, right? So of course, data is very valuable, and there's a lot of discussion about being in a data economy and having our data collected and so on and so forth. But what's interesting about data with respect to causality is that it can tell us what happened, but not necessarily why that thing happened. So I put here a simple example of a statement right from our times related to this pandemic that we've all been through. And definitely data is telling us what's happening in terms of the progress of the pandemic, but it doesn't really say why things are happening. And I think we want to know why things are happening so that we can come up with solutions that address the root causes and to gain not only understanding of what causes certain things, but also to gain some trust, right? Because most of the times when we work with some kind of technique which is complex, right? So it appears more or less like a black box. We have to trust that it will not break in unforeseen situations, right? So deep learning obviously is something that is talked about a lot these days. And deep learning is a set of techniques that nails correlations really well. But we've all seen those examples of deep learners that were performing very well. So they were coming up with the correct answers, the correct classifications or predictions, but for the wrong reasons, right? And when that happens, it's likely that those correct answers may become at some point incorrect if the correlations are spurious, right? So the patterns are actually made based on spurious correlations. So the example that comes to mind here is a classifier of pictures where it always correctly identify wolves pictures, right? Just because, and they're labeled wolf, not necessarily because the machine knows that the difference between a wolf and another animal or a wolf and a dog, but because it picks up on the snow in the background that's always been there during training, right? So machine learning today, I would say, is essentially learning in a very narrow sense. It requires a lot of data to perform relatively targeted tasks like play a game or classify images. I was reading the other day about this OpenAI multiplayer game, right? That has they achieved like very good performance, but it was based on 45,000 equivalent years of gameplay, right? So this is something that not a lot of domains can afford this kind of size of data, and it's also really not sustainable, right? General intelligence is more based on awareness, right? It involves ability to generalize and also consciousness. So understanding causal relations, I think that's something that helps us perhaps prune the large space of things and that we consider every day when we make intelligent decisions in the matter of microseconds and milliseconds. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through some concrete examples here. One of the things that we learn early on in statistics, right, is that correlation doesn't mean causation. But I think it's equally important to highlight the fact that lack of correlation doesn't mean lack of causation. So I'm going to show some examples related to financial modeling. So I have here three stochastic processes. Let's call them the blue, the orange, and the green. And blue is a geometric Brownian motion. It's used a lot in finance. And then the green is a mean reverting process. And as we can see here, the orange is highly correlated with the blue, right? So there's a measured correlation of 93%, whereas blue and green, even though they're almost superimposed in terms of their graphs, right, on here, you hardly can see the difference between them. They are really, according to this correlation measure, they're not correlated, almost not correlated, right? The correlation is 2%. But clearly we see also from the definition of process Z, the green process, that X enters by construction into this definition. So technically X or changes in X would cause changes in Z, but that's something that often gets ignored just because the correlation is low. So these processes may be considered unrelated when in fact they are. The other thing that we do in finance is we commonly use correlation knowing that it's a linear measure of association when the data is not really linearly associated. So here's an example of, again, two processes, X and Y, or blue and orange. X is a quadratic process, and it enters into the definition of Y, right? So again, a causal relationship, because changes in X will definitely cause Y to move. And then the strength of the influence is controlled by this parameter gamma. So when gamma is not zero, there's a clear relationship between the two processes. What's shown in the graph are the returns, right? This is what we usually work with in finance. And so I chose to split the return time series into three equal time steps at the beginning, right? And calculate correlations in each one of these intervals for some set value of gamma that's non-zero, right? So for the first interval, interval number 1, we get a measured correlation of 65%. Then it flips to negative on interval 2, minus 31%, and then it goes back to positive at 45%. So one could falsely draw the conclusion that because of this changing correlation, there's a change in regime, right? People talk about market regimes and correlation breaks, and there's a regime change and so on. But really nothing's changed here. I mean, the same quadratic process X influence, in the same quadratic, in the same process Y, it's just that we're measuring their association through a linear dependence that obviously will not capture the true association, which is nonlinear. So this is why I think more types of associations are necessary, definitely causality being one of them. And in terms of how do we go about measuring causality? So I mean, this real reason why it's been not used as much as correlation, for example, is because it's particularly difficult to identify and capture and measure and so on, right? So the preferred way is really using randomized trials where you take the data, you basically split it into two groups, one group that receives an intervention, the other group that doesn't, and then you observe the outcomes, right? And while this may be ideal, it's really not always feasible in practice, right? For various reasons, whether ethical reasons, whether it's literally not possible to experiment with certain types of, let's say, experiment on people, or it could be expensive and time consuming and so on. So then the question becomes like, what can we do based on just data? Can we come up with some measures of causality or the type of relationships that are not necessarily just correlation relationships? How do we extract that from data? So there are several categories of techniques, right, that people have come up with, and in sort of order of chronological order, I put them here as statistical, information theoretical, state space, and so on. So without going into a lot of details, I just want to touch base. So the first set of methods that have come about were literally generalizations, started with generalizations of correlation, but there are all these progressively more sophisticated techniques. First, it was just a generalization of the cross-correlation coefficient. Then Granger came up with the notion of co-integration, which is what I was showing earlier in the first example, right? And then the Granger causality, right? So here the idea is that you can have some sort of statistical causality. So it's not causality in the true sense, but it's statistical causality in the sense of you're able to predict a certain random process or a certain random variable by using not only the past history of itself, but also another random variable. And if that gives you a better prediction, then by this definition, you can say that you have the second random variable be causal to the first, right? So now there are obviously shortcomings with this type of technique, some of them being that they make certain assumptions about the data, statistical assumptions about the data, and then others being that it's not so clear to how to assess directionality. So new sets of methods were developed to address some of these gaps. Information theoretical methods, for example, fill the gaps primarily related to these rigid assumptions of stationarities in the statistical methods, and also the lack of directionality by using this concept of transfer entropy or mutual information shared by one or gained in one random variable by observing another, right? And then both these sets of techniques have one big, let's say, downside, which is that they require the cause and effect relationship to be somewhat separable in time, right? So cause happens first and then effect follows. Whereas in complex systems such as our brains or climate or financial markets, things are never that black and white. They're never that simple, right? Usually there is this cyclicality of effect or of cause and effect, or iteration of cause and effect, where A causes B, let's say, but B causes C and so on. And then it could be that there's a cycle that goes back to A, right? So it's not just, in terms of graph theory, the causal structure is not just a tree, but it could have cycles. It's a cyclical graph, right? So for that kind of situation, these topological methods have been developed where these actually come more from, I guess, the biological domain, right, where people were always encountering these very complex systems. And the idea here is that you can see the complex system as a manifold. It is a very complex manifold, but then you observe it through projections of it onto submanifolds. And then there are some theoretical results like Taken's theorem that pretty much say how you can reconstruct this complex or the behavior of this complex system from partial measurements of its internal states. And there are techniques like the convergent cross mapping, which is a tool that incorporates causality through the use of topologically equivalent states and seeing or checking for the signature of one state into the signature of another. So in practical terms, I would say, interestingly enough, causality is the bread and butter of finance, in the sense that you hear portfolio managers, for example, always talk about sources of alphas, right? So the root cause, the cause of, how can we find what generates alpha? But you won't hear people talk a lot about causality in on a trading floor. There's a lot of talk about correlation, and there are important reasons for that, right? I would say two main reasons, which is it's very easy to compute correlations, and it's also very intuitive to interpret, right? So you have a number between -1 and 1, and everybody has an intuition about what that means. Whereas for causality, the challenges are that not only is it difficult to identify, but once it's identified with all these techniques that, like I mentioned before, there's also a question of what that number means, right? Usually there's a score that comes out of these methods that reflect some strength of causality relationship. But a 0.8 in one technique doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as a 0.8 in another technique, right? So we don't have a standard way of looking at things. And then the other, I guess, challenge, but hopefully also something that helps with causality is that the causality networks. So there is this network structure of different cause effects. Like I said, in complex systems, that this can become very untenable to draw or to visualize. But on the other hand, it helps, right, to see when we can zoom in parts, in local parts of the structure. It helps to see the cause effect, but also how this structure changes over time. And so, just to see some examples, again, going back to the original stochastic processes that I had in the first example. So I chose to compare Granger causality with convergent cross mapping and see how well they do on that simple example. So remember that we had the blue and the orange that were highly correlated, but not necessarily causally related. And then we had the blue and the green, which were there's a statistical causality relationship between X and Z, but not the other way around necessarily. So let's see. So in the Granger causality line, like I have these tables that are tables of p-values, and we can see that, for example, for the case of X causes Y or Y causes X, there's no causality detected, right? So the p-values are pretty high. Whereas in the cases of X and Z relationship with beta non-zero, right? So beta 1 is more influence of X on Z, beta 0.1 is 10 times less, but it's still non-zero. It's detecting that through these low p-value, and it's also detecting correctly that X statistically causes Z, or Granger causes Z, but not the other way around. In the convergent cross mapping case, without going into a lot of explanations of the setup, I will just say that these scatter plots basically think of it as showing with the color scheme showing both directions of causality, so x predicting y and y predicting x, and then the closer they are to the diagonal, that means that the better the strength of that causality. So here is just a visual assessment without I didn't include any numbers. So we can see that in the XY column, for example, there's no particular pattern. These things are pretty scattered away from the diagonal. When the strength of the causality is pretty high on the XZ relationship, both directions are clustering around the diagonal, so there's no difference between x causes y and y causes, x causes z and z causes x. And then as we lower that beta coefficient, then it becomes fuzzier. So in this case, I would say the Granger causality is the better indicator. Whereas, of course, there will be cases, and this is the case, for example, with that nonlinear example that I showed before, x and y, right, where the convergent cross mapping performs better. So if you look at the Granger line, you will see that there's some confusion there between the causality x, y, and yx. Whereas on the convergent cross mapping case, when gamma, for example, is 0.8, so on the rightmost graph, we can see clearly that x causes y is very nicely coming along the diagonal, whereas the other direction is not, right? So, and then we can also look at these techniques in terms of real time series data. So here I took some time series of oil stocks. So ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and an energy sector ETF that has ExxonMobil as its top holding at around 28%. And then ConocoPhillips was its third holding, so much less, under 5%. And as we can see here, both techniques reflect some of these causal links correctly, but then they also produce some spurious causality, like, for example, in the rightmost CCM graph, where there's a bidirectional link between ExxonMobil and the ETF, which shouldn't really be bidirectional, right? So it's almost looks like they're similarly affecting each other. So it's pretty clear that there's a strong motivation for getting causality to work in financial data for the reasons that I mentioned. But there are obviously serious challenges to overcome, and these are related to process, to data, and also to the amount of computation required, right? And in spite of this, there are some interesting results, and people have used causality to study market structure, to do dimensionality reduction and filtering and so on. But at the same time, and perhaps I won't have time to go through the full presentation, but I just want to make a last remark here, that there is strong motivation to look into causality also from a general AI machine learning perspective, because if we want to build machines that are truly intelligent, we want to move away from the current learning paradigms that tend to just throw more data and more computation to a particular task, and try to understand how intelligence is expressed through the reuse of knowledge in never before seen situation, right? So like I was mentioning before, we don't have, for example, in a field like finance, we don't have the equivalent of 45,000 years of data when you just look at daily time series, sometimes even not daily, like even sparser, you barely have thousands of samples, right? So it's not sustainable. I have a few more charts that I wanted to go through, but it looks like I'm coming up on time. So I think this is perhaps a good place to wrap up. And the one thing maybe I'll flip to the conclusion to say that there's not a lot of convergence yet. It's a very hard problem, causality, and it's not a lot of convergence in terms of agreement of which technique to use, and these are still being explored. But I think there's one thing that people can agree on is that the path to general intelligence without causality is unlikely. And I like to think about it because I feel like it involves a lot of knowledge, and it connects many fields like statistics, machine learning, decision theory, game theory, and psychology, and so on. So it's a very interesting topic. I hope it will encourage you to have a look at it, give it some thought, and thank you for listening.
Wow, Yana, thank you so much. That was amazing. And I know this virtual audience is giving you a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for taking time to share with us. For the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. Along the way, make sure you accept your connection request and take some time to check out our amazing exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.